You are listening to Stranger Than Fiction, Corruption and Crimes Against Humanity in the COVID Era, an audiobook by N.B. Austin. This is a free audiobook, but if you enjoy what you're listening to, you'd like to cut ahead quicker, you'd like to have access to all the citations, it's also available in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Even if reading is not quite your thing and you prefer to listen, buying a copy is a great way to support and is much appreciated. Finally, be sure to like, subscribe, share with friends and family, and most importantly, if you do buy a book, leave a review on Amazon. All of the above help tremendously in getting this information out there and turning the tide on medical tyranny. Now, without further ado, let's begin with Chapter 7, Statistical Fraud. Quote, I think people have gotten used to the fact that wearing masks, clearly if you look at the data, it diminishes respiratory diseases. We've had practically a non-existent flu season this year, merely because people were doing the kinds of public health things they were directed predominantly against COVID-19. End quote. Anthony Fauci, May 2021. One of the most incredible phenomena I personally experienced during the COVID era was not just the magical disappearance of the flu, but also the reaction of people to this disappearance. When CDC flu case estimates ranged from 36 to 45 million per year from 2017 to 2019, and then case counts came in at 1,675 in 2020, while at the same time their COVID case count for 2020 was just below 21 million, my first thoughts were along the lines of, okay, finally. This is the thing that's not possible to miss. This is the thing that's going to wake everyone up from their slumber because there's no possible way to spin this. Mass testing for this respiratory disease with the same types of symptoms as the flu made the flu go to zero as it rose to comparable case rates as previous flu estimates made without mass testing. Obviously, it's the flu. Obviously, everyone will see this now. At long last, they took things too far. Unfortunately, I got ahead of myself and forgot that no matter how unbelievably dumb the answer is, salesman Anthony Fauci has an answer for everything. And in this case, as can be seen above, his answer was that the flu is a respiratory disease, and respiratory diseases spread via droplet, which masks clearly prevent. So the flu is gone because people wore masks. No, that isn't a joke. That is the actual position of the director of NIAID, and one which was somehow accepted by people with brains. And I truly can't even begin to wrap my head around how one reasons that out. Is the influenza virus bigger than SARS-CoV-2, causing it to get blocked by masks more? No, influenza is in the same range as SARS-CoV-2, 150 to 140 nanometers as previously discussed, at 80 to 120 nanometers. So there's no reason at all to think the two would behave differently in the air. I guess the message is to just ignore that though, because the only way to make sense is to ignore all logic and reasoning. Severe acute respiratory syndrome is a respiratory disease from a virus which masks can apparently not prevent the pandemic spread of, while the flu is a respiratory disease from the same size virus which masks can apparently cause to completely vanish. And if you have a problem with any of that, well, too bad, because in Fauci's high opinion, quote, a lot of what you're seeing as attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science because all of the things I have spoken about from the very beginning have fundamentally been based on science. End quote. No, this is not a comedy book or a dystopian fiction. These are things people in positions of authority actually said, which is why I find it so important to document. And even if one is to accept Fauci's premise here, it implies a career-long failure on his part. As you will recall, Fauci laughed off the idea of mask wearing in 2019 and warned against it on several other occasions. So if we are to believe something so simple could have eliminated the flu this whole time, then what was Fauci doing as the director of NIAID recommending against it for almost 40 years? Now don't get me wrong here. I understand why people would think COVID is different from the flu, because what people endured in hospitals was very different thanks to a dramatic change in treatment practices. More on this in the next chapter. The fullness of hospitals and ICUs alone, however, is not a remotely new occurrence despite the incessant media fear porn of the contrary. For example, an article from The Guardian described how UK hospitals were, quote, full to bursting in 2012. Oh, and then another explained how they faced the, quote, toughest ever winter in 2013. And then faced another, quote, winter crisis in 2014. And then hospital bed occupancy rates hit record highs, quote, risking care in 2015. And then in 2016, NHS hospitals faced their, quote, toughest winter yet once again. but not before hospitals got, quote, dangerously full during the winter crisis in 2017, which was nothing compared to the, quote, toughest ever winter crisis of 2018, nor did it hold a candle to 2019's, quote, breaking point over lack of intensive care beds. For people outside of hospitals, the main symptom used to distinguish this allegedly new disease was the loss of taste and/or smell. Even this complication, however, is not uncommon during a case of the flu, nor is this new information. In fact, in February of 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that, quote, some patients complain that they are unable to smell things or to taste food after a bout of influenza. They even mentioned the phenomena was a material enough concern to have been at the attention of the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, among others. While the flu vanishing mental gymnastics are a big deal, we've only just begun to scratch the surface on the statistical and logical misdirection which took place over the course of the alleged pandemic by public health officials. As a health statistician, it has been particularly devastating to see traditional methodologies and standards of practice abandoned at will without any pushback from organizations which should have been perfectly positioned to call out the obvious fraud and madness. Instead, seemingly all individual resistance or outright whistleblowing was stamped out with censorship and/or credential stripping, like those we've covered previously. Unfortunately for the censors, however, the truth lives on, so we will cover it point by point. COVID mortality, a complete fraud. Quote, in cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID-19 cannot be made, but it is suspected or likely, for example, the circumstances are compelling with a reasonable degree of certainty, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. End quote. CDC guidance for certifying COVID-19 deaths. Quote, if you were in hospice and had already been given a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means technically, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but that they had COVID at the time of death. End quote. Illinois Department of Public Health Director Dr. Ngozi Ezike, 2020. It was hard for me to not emphasize the entirety of the previous quote. As someone whose job it is to determine and interpret health, morbidity, and mortality methodology, this one point is what broke the entire pandemic narrative for me in the spring of 2020. To my shock then and amusement now, the apparent will to, quote, trust experts largely did not apply when it came to my own expertise on this topic, even with members of my own family. Still, none of the peers in my field could explain this egregious error away when questioned on it, nor could anyone who doubted my declaration that this methodology represents statistical fraud. In many ways, I accept responsibility for their doubt. Any honest scientist would readily admit that if they can't explain their opinions to you in a simple enough way for you to understand and restate, then you certainly should doubt or disregard them. This is a standard of practice for most organizations, though hopefully this book does a decent job of demonstrating the extent to which it has been disregarded in favor of anti-scientific coercion. In my case, though, I've tried to follow it by focusing on simplifying my message as best I can in normal conversation, while also writing a book for those who were interested enough to get the full background. I'd recommend anyone trying to convince others of any opinion to try their best to do the same, i.e. simplify. You don't have to write a book, though you should if you're passionate enough about the subject. To get back to why this methodology constitutes statistical fraud, though, we can first start explaining this in the context of cause and effect. So far, we have touched on the fact that viruses fill the human body. Therefore, the presence of a virus at the time of death does not imply cause any more than the presence of a red shirt on the deceased person's body. The quotes above and methodologies of public health departments the world over reveal they ignored simple cause and effect when counting what they called COVID deaths. Simply put, this means that the 724,000 COVID deaths to date, as of October 20, 2021, cannot be assumed to have been caused by the alleged novel coronavirus because public health departments included deaths with, quote, clear alternate cause and even deaths presumed to be COVID-related with no evidence of the virus causing it. States like New York were documented as having abused this presumed caveat as well, as in April of 2020, New York City added 3,778 deaths to its 10,367 total, where no test or confirmation was done at all, but death certificates made the presumption and listed the death as, quote, COVID-19 or an equivalent. The second problem with these counts is the bias introduced by adding frequent testing to the 28 to 60 day post-test death threshold utilized in many places. To explain this issue with an example, let's say I watch a scary movie which causes me to jump in my seat. If within 60 days of watching this movie that makes me jump, a positive test, I have a heart attack, is it safe to assume based on that alone the movie caused the heart attack? Of course not. But if I watch one movie in the year and it does make me jump, under the public health methodology, there will be 60 days of the year where anything I die from will be included as a scary movie death. Now let's say I watch a scary movie every weekday for an entire year because my job requires it. Under those circumstances, with a 60-day threshold each time, the number of days in the year which I could be counted could be every single day, as long as a subsequent movie makes me jump within a 60-day period of the last time I jumped. Obviously, this would increase the probability of my CDC-classified scary movie death from the actual probability of a scary movie death in a year, which is 0. And based on what we know about the testing, jumping at a scary movie isn't much less reliable as a signal of heart attack than a PCR test is a signal of the novel coronavirus. The PCR test doesn't test for or specifically identify the novel coronavirus at all, so this makes the number of days in a year attributable as a COVID death for each person even more ambiguous. For a more specific, yet still simple mathematical example of this, consider the CDC assertion that the average person gets a cold, coronavirus, 2 to 3 times per year. If we were to test everyone for colds and counted every death within a threshold of 44 days, the midpoint of 28 to 60 day range, there would be about 110 days per year each person could be considered a cold death, assuming about 2.5 colds per year on average. 110 being the 2.5 colds times the 44-day threshold. This is about 30% of a 365-day year that you could be considered a cold death, no matter what you die from. So considering there were about 3.4 million total US deaths in 2020, and that the frequent testing only occurred in 9 months of the year after the COVID era began in March of 2020, we would expect cold deaths to come in at just shy of 765,000. 30% of the year times 3.4 million total deaths times 9 over 12. However, not everyone gets tested. My family and I never did, for example. And many of the people who did get tested will not have tested every day or every time they get a cold in 2020. If we assume this imperfect testing accounts for anywhere from 25 to 75% reduction in tested colds, we would have an expected range of cold deaths between 191,000 and 575,000. A 50% reduction would represent approximately 382,000 cold deaths. For context, the CDC attributes approximately 375,000 deaths to COVID in 2020. So while this is a simple imperfect math example, you can see how their new testing and mortality regimen could have easily led to these conclusions, no matter the cause of the 2019 to 2020 jump in total deaths from about 2.9 million to 3.4 million. That this regimen was new to the COVID era is also an extremely relevant point to dive in on. A 2020 report by Ely et al. In Science, Public Health Policy and the Law titled COVID-19 Data Collection, Comorbidity, and Federal Law, a Historical Retrospective, questioned the CDC on why they would, quote, decide against using a system of data collection and reporting they authored and which has been used nationwide for 17 years without incident in favor of an untested and unproven system exclusively for COVID-19 without discussion and peer review, end quote. What they specifically reference toward this change is the 2003 Medical Examiners and Coroners Handbook on Death Registration and Fetal Death Reporting and Physician's Handbook on Medical Certification of Death, published by the CDC itself. This document's death criteria, quote, have been used successfully for 17 years without need of update and, quote, remain in use today for all causes of death except where COVID-19 is suspected or confirmed, in which case, quote, the March 24th, 2020 COVID-19 Alert Number 2 guidelines are used instead, end quote. The authors go on to continue raising several other data integrity offenses by the CDC and their legal implications before reaching a similar conclusion as we already have. Quote, with the inclusion of probable fatalities and significant changes made to how certificates of death are recorded exclusively for COVID-19, scientific objectivity demands that we acknowledge the data presented is inaccurate. Federal agencies have a legal obligation to provide the most accurate data to the public, fellow agencies, and policymakers they are advising, and they have a responsibility to abide by every federal law. This responsibility to collect, analyze, and publish data accurately, transparently, and with unquestionable integrity increases exponentially during a national crisis. It is concerning that the CDC may have willfully failed to collect, analyze, and publish accurate data used by elected officials to develop public health policy for a nation in crisis. End quote. The final issue that has caused biased COVID mortality data, and also case and morbidity data for that matter, is the financial incentive structure public health departments and the governments they advised set up during the alleged pandemic. Per an announcement from the US DHHS in July of 2020, certain hospitals in high-impact areas would receive as much as $55,000 per COVID-19 admission, down from $77,000 per admission in earlier months. These payments would also be based on how the hospital's COVID patient rate compared to national averages. What this creates is an obvious and disturbing incentive to diagnose in a potentially competitive ecosystem. Then acting CDC Director Robert Redfield even acknowledged this issue while reporting to the U.S. Congress at the time. Quote, in the HIV epidemic, somebody may have a heart attack but also have HIV. The hospital would prefer the DRG, the death report, for HIV because there's greater reimbursement. So I do think there is some reality to that. End quote. And Admiral Brett Giroir, DHHS Assistant Secretary of Health, concurred. Quote, the CDC that gathers the statistics is completely dependent on the reports of the local coroners. Yes, there appear to be some misincentives to overcode. End quote. Why then Director Redfield gets away with addressing this in such a casual manner is beyond me. The reporting these hospitals have provided during both this pandemic and during AIDS has been used to justify actions which have had enormous consequences on all matter of human health and rights. To have such dramatic potential for fraud built into that reporting should warrant firings at minimum for the policy setters responsible. And we saw this potential more than realized during the COVID era. For example, Doctors Dan Erickson and Artin Masihi held a press conference, yet another ultimately censored by YouTube, as early as April 2020, where they acknowledged hospitals were pressuring physicians to add COVID to death certificates and diagnostics. Each of the incomprehensible methodologies of public health together allow for only one certain conclusion. The claim that 724,000 people, or whatever number is officially cited at the time, died with a cause or even a contribution of death by the novel coronavirus is a falsehood. The contribution piece is important as well because it is also false to claim the 724 might not have died of it, but if it wasn't for the virus, they otherwise wouldn't have died. Given the faults of the testing, as well as the absurdity of pretending to know with any confidence they wouldn't have otherwise died with their known comorbidities, this is a claim without evidence. And don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying the approximately 17.7% increase in total US deaths in 2020 didn't happen. In the absence of any other explanation, it might even make sense to attribute this increase to a mysterious new disease called COVID-19. However, even beyond the simple alternative explanations of unprecedented despair, increased poverty, unsanitary and unhealthy mandates, healthcare system breakdown, etc. caused by public health actions, there is significant evidence of far more directly causative alternative explanations as well. We will touch on those alternatives and the evidence supporting them in the chapters ahead. In fact, one need only look north to our maple syrup-loving brothers and sisters in Canada to completely rule out an indiscriminate pandemic as the cause of the U.S. death toll. To this end, a statistical mortality analysis called Analysis of All-Cause Mortality by Week in Canada 2010 to 2021 by province, age, and sex was published in August 2021 by Drs. Denis Rancourt, Marine Baudin, and Jérémy Mercier. The authors started by stating the two defining characteristics of a pandemic, namely that it occurs everywhere because there is no prior immunity, and that it causes excess mortality far greater than occurs on a normal seasonal basis. Based on their analysis of the official government data, they found neither definition to be met. Mortality was not uniform across jurisdictions, and in Canada at least, it was not abnormal in total as far as excess mortality. These factors led to their conclusion that, quote, there was no pandemic in the COVID period in Canada, and that the, quote, pandemic response was so aggressive and ill-advised as to have large negative health consequences, end quote. Dr. Rancour and the same team did go on to investigate why, unlike Canada, the U.S. did show excess mortality during the COVID era in a subsequent report titled Nature of the COVID-Era Public Health Disaster in the USA from All-Cause Mortality and Sociogenomic and Climatic Data. The findings of this report are similar to the conclusions we have and will continue to draw here, namely, the response is what is most attributable to the disaster. But many of the factors within the response which allowed for such death to occur, we have yet to touch on, so I will refrain from diving too deep on all the ways this second report aligns with my own thesis. For now, we can also see these conclusions we've drawn about false mortality rates play out in the world with several examples. First, as highlighted in a resignation letter by a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer forced out of his position due to his refusal to take the mRNA inoculations, the world's death rate, the number claimed to have died as a percentage of the population, was the same in 2018, 2019, and 2020 at 0.76%. Second, Colorado coroner Brenda Bach found 2 of the 5 deaths, 40%, attributed to COVID-19 in her one county alone were people who actually died of gunshot wounds. Third, on the other side of the world, in Australia, the following came from local news station One News in Auckland. Quote, today, the Ministry of Health added another death to its COVID-19 reporting, but also said it was a case subject to police investigation that's ongoing. Now, One News understands that this is in relation to Operation, name unclear, a homicide investigation launched after a man named Robert Hart sustained serious injuries outside of Newland Hotel last week, and he died despite first aid attempts. Now, health authorities say he tested positive for COVID-19, and One News understands that several people are also isolating. So then you have to ask how someone who sustained these types of injuries and dies ends up as part of our COVID-19 death tally. Now the Ministry of Health says that's because under the World Health Organization's guidelines, anyone who dies while also having an acute COVID-19 infection is recorded as part of the nation's death tally, whatever the cause of death might be. End quote. A few side notes here. The first being the WHO should be charged with or considered guilty of criminal fraud and or conspiracy for this guideline at a bare minimum, as should any public health organization with a similar guideline. This is such an egregiously misguided policy that malicious intent isn't even relevant, though it almost has to be assumed, given how wildly off base and misrepresentative the guidance is. This scenario clearly demonstrates that Colorado coroner Bach's experience was not only not a geographically isolated incident during a short period of time where unintentional guidelines mistakes were made, but was actually standard practice for the majority, if not all, of the world during the entire alleged pandemic under the WHO's auspices. Lastly, I just have to point out again how incredibly hilarious the "so then you have to ask" line is, as well as how dumb the corporate media must think or know its audience has been made thanks to its complete abolition of truth and logic from its broadcasts. It's truly a marvel of the modern world. Fourth, the Orange County Department of Health was forced to correct a traffic fatality incident identified as a COVID-19 death. Fifth, the U.S. makes up 4.2% of the world's population, but 18.8% of the world's deaths allegedly caused by an indiscriminate infectious virus spreading around the world. To summarize, 360,000 COVID deaths in the U.S. in 2020 divided by 1.92 million COVID deaths worldwide in 2020 is 18.8%. The 331 million U.S. population in 2020 divided by the 7.8 billion worldwide population in 2020 makes up the 4.2%. This is an overrepresentation of more than 4 times and lends further support to causes of death specific to the U.S. public health course of action while reducing support for an indiscriminate infectious virus. And only 2 conclusions can come from this astounding statistic. First, U.S. COVID death counts are correct. We can say with 100% certainty they aren't, which means the responses of the NIH, CDC, and FDA were a complete failure and all involved should be immediately removed from their positions for gross incompetence. Second, the U.S. COVID death counts are dramatically incorrect, which means those organizations either intentionally committed fraud on an epic scale, which is likely for reasons to be discussed, or simply demonstrated gross incompetence in their methodologies. By January 2022, the DHHS removed its COVID death reporting requirement for U.S. hospitals, with many hospitals ceasing to report by the middle of the month. The reason for this cover-up is ultimately the same as the reason for the 2020 changes in mortality methodology, Namely, the scary data was needed in 2020 to justify the mass mRNA inoculation campaign of 2021. I will prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt very soon. For now, we continue with more on how to manufacture a pandemic. A case study in confirmation bias, the Seattle windshield pitting pseudo-epidemic. On March 23, 1954, press accounts reporting windshield damage began to appear in Seattle newspapers. The accounts of dime-sized pits stemmed initially from a town 80 miles north of Seattle, but by mid-April the cases moved south into the city, and in some cases entire parking lots were reported to police as having been struck. Within days, reported cases dropped to zero. However, fear of future cases remained and theories started to spread, including sand flea eggs had somehow been deposited in the glass and later hatched, atomic fallout from hydrogen bomb tests in the Pacific, or acid rain. The concern eventually became so great that on April 15th, the mayor of Seattle sought the help of then-President Dwight Eisenhower. A team was soon arranged to investigate, and the findings were surprising to residents and sociologists alike. The incidence of pits was the same as ever. Yes, the truth was there was no epidemic. The pits always existed and resulted from mundane, ordinary road wear. The problem was that with the onset of increased news coverage and rumor, residents of Seattle began looking at their windshields from the outside instead of through them from the inside as they'd always done previously. In his retelling of this incident, author Robert Bartholomew acknowledges the following sociological findings of the Seattle investigators Nahum Z. Medallia and Otto N. Larson. Quote, "The literature on mass or collective delusions indicates the pivotal role of several key factors. These include the presence of ambiguity, anxiety, the spread of rumors and false but plausible beliefs, and a redefinition of the potential threat from general and distant to specific and imminent. Exacerbating factors include human perpetual fallibility, mass media influence in spreading the fears, recent geopolitical events, and a reinforcement of the false belief by authority figures and those in institutions of social control, for example, the police, military, a university lecturer, or the head of the Washington Skeptics." In their conclusions, Medallia and Larson note at least two other possible functions of the pitting delusion. Firstly, as the pitting reports coincided with the H-bomb tests, the media publicity seems to have reduced tension about the inevitable dire consequences of the bomb tests. For example, people thinking something was bound to happen to us as a result of the H-bomb tests, windshields became pitted, it's happened, now that threat is over. Secondly, the very act of telephoning police and appeals by the mayor to the governor and even the president of the United States served to give people the sense that they were doing something about the danger that threatened. End quote. Bartholomew goes on to cite other examples of mass delusions, but hopefully by now a picture is starting to form about how real such vast delusions are. And the comparisons to the alleged COVID pandemic are easy to make, with the biggest difference being the damage avoided by the more honest conclusions reached during the Seattle pseudo-epidemic. These honest, simple conclusions, in spite of the hysteria created by manic media coverage, prevented the type of disastrous counteraction experienced during the COVID era. Unfortunately, the CDC, NIH, FDA, and WHO have not been honest or tempered in their actions, as we've already seen and will continue to see. In an incredible mirroring of Bartholomew's analysis, the anxiety-causing, rumor-spreading threat started as general and distant, sick people in China, before becoming specific and imminent. Pandemic outbreak has spread around the world. Mass media then blasted, to cite Bill Gates' Event 201 recommendation language, the airwaves with the exact authoritative sources from institutions of social control, public health, government, police, mentioned both by Bartholomew above and in Bill Gates' Event 201 recommendations. Finally, with each public health action, no matter how coercive, damaging, or illogical, the anxiousness is given relief as the sense that someone is doing something is more important to the subjects of delusion than what is actually being done. Unfortunately, however, in the case of the alleged pandemic, the relief is only ever temporary. The threat is constantly re-emerging as a new case spike or virus variant, which requires continuous anxiousness relief actions as outlined in this book. The great irony is these relief actions always seem to cause more damage for everyone except the wallets of those responsible for taking or enforcing them. We will analyze these conflicts of interest in later chapters, resulting in a vicious cycle. And based on how closely this cycle seems to benefit from Bartholomew's psychological and sociological findings, it isn't a reach to at least question whether there is intent behind this phenomenon. Garbage in, garbage out, coronavirus impact projection models. As we discussed in Chapter 2, the idea to lock down in response to a pandemic started as a young girl's science fair project. Despite how compelling this child's project might have been, however, more support would be needed to take an action as drastic as locking down the entire world. So, governments turned to lockdown justifying forecasts published on March 16, 2020 by the epidemiology modeling team at Imperial College London, ICL, led by physicist Neil Ferguson. According to the New York Times, by March 17, 2020, they had already specifically credited those forecasts for their decision to take the actions Ferguson recommended. By now, we've already covered that these draconian measures not only provided no benefit to the most coercive countries, but in reality largely ended in their experiencing the worst death per capita outcomes. So we know the forecast which justified them must have been incorrect based on that alone. But just how wrong were they? Well, a 2020 study by Friedman et al. And medRxiv measuring the predictive performance of international COVID-19 mortality forecasting models found that of the 7 models compared, the ICL model had the highest 12-week error rate at 79.9%, highest 6-week error rate by 5-fold, and demonstrated an overestimation bias of 47.7%, the highest by far of all the models. And upon further review of ICL's forecasts, we can also see some pretty horrendous predictions such as the following. First, 179,000 estimated deaths in Taiwan compared to 12 actual deaths as of May 5th, 2021, off by 1,789,000%. Second, 17,461% mortality overestimation in South Korea. Third, 11,670% mortality overestimation in Japan. And fourth, a 392% mortality overestimation in Sweden. When asked why their models were so horrendously wrong, Neil Ferguson and the ICL have frequently attempted to turn their astounding overestimations into wins, which they claim, quote, may have prevented 3.1 million deaths in Europe alone. And this underscores the biggest problem with these models. Since we know that there was, at best, no correlation at all between lockdown measures and deaths, and in reality, an observable pattern connecting the most strict countries with more deaths, it is clear the most fundamental assumptions the ICL makes are flat out wrong. And if there's anything a modeler knows, it's that bad assumptions make for bad modeling. Garbage in, garbage out. And this is an issue all models face. In fact, the more assumptions a model has, the more likely it is to spit out meaningless results. In the case of the ICL model, assumptions seem to have been made about whether or not lockdowns and other measures would be useful, the extent to which they would be useful, the trajectory of alleged infection in each country, and the actions of each country at least. If any one of these assumptions is wrong, the forecast accuracy will be impacted. Now imagine if more than one are wrong. This was clearly the case with the ICL model. For example, the false assumption lockdowns were useful then leads to a false assumption about how useful they would be. This is what allows Ferguson and the ICL to fantasize in press releases about how many lives they saved. And if you can't take all of this from me, someone who has made a career out of modeling and understanding its limitations, take it from Anthony Fauci. Quote, I've looked at all the models and I've spent a lot of time on the models. They don't tell you anything. You can't really rely upon models. End quote. Fauci said this in April of 2020, a month after the model's release and subsequent influence on American officials per the New York Times. Though we don't have a quote of Fauci directly supporting or citing it in March of 2020, it is curious that these unnamed officials would be so at odds only a month earlier with the apparent figurehead of the pandemic response. Given our exhaustive coverage on Fauci speaking out of both sides of his mouth whenever convenient, and his support at the time for coercive measures such as lockdowns, it is hard to believe he wouldn't have signed on with its conclusions in March. It becomes even harder to believe when one accounts for the shocking conflicts of interest we will later find tie Fauci and the ICL. All of the above, though, is to say nothing of the fact that even if mortality counts were accurately projected by lockdown supporters, it would not support their conclusions on its own. For example, we saw my example where I modeled out COVID deaths using common cold case rates and testing assumptions. So as we've already discussed, what is far more important is how death and case counts are collected and during the COVID era, they were collected with an either careless or intentional fraudulence. So even if I came up with the simplest, most accurate trend model of COVID deaths, all I would be forecasting is the rate at which data is being misrepresented. What is a COVID case? In our section on COVID mortality methodology, we discovered that the CDC permitted the counting of probable or presumed COVID cases among the dead. But how exactly do they determine what probable means? Here's how. Quote, probable meets clinical criteria and epidemiological linkage with no confirmatory or presumptive laboratory evidence of SARS-CoV-2, or meets presumptive laboratory evidence, or meets vital records criteria with no confirmatory laboratory evidence for SARS-CoV-2. End quote. The second point refers to testing, while the third point refers to deaths being considered as cases despite having no confirmatory evidence at all. Each of these points we've discussed the faults of in great detail. The first point is what we will focus on now. Based on these distinct or definitions, we can consider each in isolation, but for the first point, there are a few more things we need to define. Specifically, we need to understand the CDC's definition of clinical and epidemiological evidence. Quote, clinical evidence. In the absence of a more likely diagnosis, acute onset or worsening of at least two of the following symptoms or signs: fever, chills, rigors, myalgia, headache, sore throat, nausea or vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, or congestion or runny nose. Or acute onset or worsening of any of the following symptoms or signs: cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, olfactory disorder, taste disorder, confusion or change in mental status, persistent pain or pressure in the chest, pale, gray, or blue-colored skin, lips, or nail beds depending on skin tone, or inability to wake or stay awake. Or severe respiratory illness with at least one of the following: clinical or radiographic evidence of pneumonia, or acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. End quote. The first bewildering point to be made about these clinical criteria is this: SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. Given this definition, it makes absolutely no sense for the third bullet to be an or bullet. We've spoken about this before, and the CDC confirms it in the same summary when they say, quote, it is assumed there is no pre-existing human immunity to the virus. End quote. If this is true, how can anyone with a novel SARS-causing virus to which they are not immune not literally have a severe acute respiratory syndrome? And if they don't have a severe acute respiratory syndrome, how can they possibly be diagnosed with a disease related to it? The answer to this second question comes from the surprisingly long symptom list the CDC provides in the first two bullets. Apparently, every single symptom a human being can experience when sick is a symptom of COVID. And the best part we can see in the second point, which is COVID can be diagnosed with as little as a cough and only a cough. In my own personal experience, this absurd CDC clinical criteria is what caused me to be denied care from an urgent care facility because along with my parasite-caused diarrhea, I also happened to have a cough. The U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention is directly responsible for my denial of care for a parasite. Think about how ironic that is. And I am certainly not an isolated case in my incident, as anyone with symptoms as common as a headache, runny nose, vomiting, or confusion are also apparently worrisome enough to warrant SARS suspicion. The social consequences the CDC has facilitated, if not outright created, around that suspicion have been comparable to psychological torture, but more on that to come. To be fair, epidemiological evidence must also support the clinical conclusions we just discussed. So next we take a look at the CDC definition for that. Quote, epidemiological linkage. One or more of the following exposures in the prior 14 days. 1. Close contact with a confirmed or probable case of COVID-19 disease. Or 2. Member of an exposed risk cohort as defined by public health authorities during an outbreak or during high community transmission. Close contact is generally defined as being within 6 feet for at least 15 minutes, cumulative over a 24-hour period. However, It depends on the exposure level and setting. For example, in the setting of an aerosol generating procedure in health settings without proper personal protective equipment, PPE, this may be defined as any duration. End quote. Considering the high likelihood of at some point encountering someone who tested positive with the tremendous false positive rate producing tests we discussed, it is pretty clear that an interaction with a probable case is very high for anyone who didn't remain in their home for the entire COVID era. In fact, a probable case can simply be someone with effectively any symptoms who interacts with another probable case, someone with effectively any symptoms. This is a backwards methodology which has completely perverted diagnostics in 2020 and 2021, as my small parasite example demonstrates. It allowed anything to be turned into COVID, and with the news blaring the fad on high 24/7, mass confirmation bias was inevitable. For those of us who lived during this time, every cough or sneeze was assumed COVID by scared people. The tremendous amount of evidence and whistleblowing which has accumulated out of hospitals as a result show my example was just one in an entire medical system worth of others. By early 2022, after almost 2 years of pretending otherwise, at a time when they needed it to look like the inoculations weren't failing as they undeniably were for the children of whom they'd recently been authorized, Anthony Fauci was forced to admit the truth of the COVID case situation. Quote, "If you look at the children that are hospitalized with COVID, many of them are hospitalized with COVID as opposed to because of COVID." End quote. Many other faithful servants, including New York Governor Kathy Hochul, echoed the new talking point. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky even went as far as to finally confess as many as 40% of COVID hospitalizations were not actually admitted for any COVID-type illness, flu or respiratory, while more still came in with only mild cold or flu symptoms. The number was, in fact, slightly higher than 40% in New York, and if you acknowledge that many of the test results are useless, there's no reason to think the other 60% are receiving a meaningful diagnosis either, but we've already covered that. Still, the implications we will demonstrate this to have had because of the lack of normal treatment for COVID patients were enormous and put the 17.7% mortality increase which resulted into context. This was a complete failure of the hospital system caused by the centralizing influence of the public health organizations themselves. And though they might now pretend they couldn't have known, they did know, and they spent the entirety of the prior 2 years responding to anyone who pointed it out with fact checks and the slanderous claim of misinformation. Has SARS-CoV-2 ever been isolated? There is a lot of debate on the topic of whether SARS-CoV-2 has ever even truly been isolated in a purified sample and also demonstrated to cause the never-ending symptomless disease called COVID. Given the CDC's willingness to declare asymptomatic infection possible and thus admit it doesn't necessarily cause disease, this seems like a more than fair thing to investigate. We will touch on the points of that debate in a moment. The most important questions I have always had on this topic, though, which in my opinion are far more important than the debate over whether or not a specific paper shows the actual virus, are the following. 1. As we remember from the previous chapter, the actual virus was admitted as not having been available to the Corman-Drosten PCR testing protocol developers. Instead, they used a theoretical in silico version of the virus in order to calibrate the tests. Given this, if the virus was newly isolated at any point after the Corman-Drosten test was developed, as is claimed, how then can it be explained that this protocol was not completely scrapped by the WHO immediately following isolation? 2. Why wouldn't the tests at least require immediate recalibration based on the newly isolated virus, considering it could not have possibly matched the in silico version? 3. If the CDC's test is different from the Corman-Drosten WHO-sponsored test, why is it different, and how can there not be a comparison on accuracy to standardize the tests? 4. Why was an analysis not completed, documented, and explained for how different the in silico and actual viruses were? 5. Is the claim that the theoretically modeled virus the exact same as the one which actually occurred in nature? If so, we've already touched on the inaccuracy of models and why this is not remotely believable. 6. Why did it take until December 2020 for a team of disinterested external scientists to peer review and demand rejection of this in silico protocol? 7. Why even after this external peer review did the WHO never formally acknowledge the error of their ways? These are questions which never get answered because those they seek to query refuse to dialogue with those who have the audacity to ask such reasonable, important questions. Now, before we get into the subject of viral isolation, I must be fully transparent. I am obviously not a virologist or biologist, so speaking to the specifics of lab work, electron microscopy, and the meaningfulness of purification is not something I'm going to pretend I have the background to do. What I will say, though, is that especially on such a complicated topic, it is as important as ever to take nothing at face value. There is no claim on any topic made by any person which should be beyond your comprehension enough to simply accept without some form of support or predictive ability. If there is something that doesn't make sense or is confusing, questions must be asked until any issues are resolved. As Hitchens' razor dictates, the burden of proof regarding the truthfulness of a claim lies with the one who makes the claim. In this case, the burden of proof is on the public health organizations and proponents of the novel coronavirus theory, who in my opinion have failed miserably to provide satisfactory proof on any of the subjects which we have or will discuss. At the same time, I've already laid out fundamental problems I see which inherently suggest that either the virus hasn't actually been isolated at all, or whatever is being seen under the microscope hasn't been demonstrated to cause disease if it has. What I will highlight beyond that will focus on the opinions of scientists who are better equipped than myself to go deeper than that on viral identification. And I find it particularly necessary to document them for 4 reasons, which we will elaborate on. First, the process of isolation, as the CDC describes it, and mainstream virology apparently, seems to make no sense at all to me as far as what the assumed definition of isolation should be. Second, the predictive ability of these opposition scientists as it relates to treatments, mitigation recommendations, etc., has been far superior to that of the public health organizations from whose opinions on this subject they differ. In fact, a better distinction would be they treat people and the public health organizations do not. Also, by stark contrast to public health, the prescriptions and solutions of the aforementioned scientists have largely been humane, and they have not been coercive. Third, the primary question as it relates to the alleged novel coronavirus is the same question Kary Mullis was unable to find an answer to as it related to HIV. Specifically, where is the paper which demonstrates SARS-CoV-2 isolated from a symptomatic person and then brought in contact with a healthy person or cell causes the disease called COVID-19? Fourth, as stated in the author's note, one of the primary purposes of this book is to document the history which authoritarian censors have openly admitted in Event 201, social media, etc., to trying to erase from the consciousness of the masses. The scientists who give these opinions have universally been the subject of this censorship, despite their sterling credentials. In a well-functioning society, however, a public debate would have been had between both sides and featured by our largest institutions. Not only did the unelected public health authority figures demanding such dramatic societal changes not engage in such a debate, they actively attempted to and called for the suppression of the other side. Thanks to algorithms and the extreme centralization of the mainstream media, in many ways they succeeded. For the sake of human health, dignity, and intellectual advancement, however, this cannot be permitted to go unanswered. So, without further caveat, I will focus mostly on a summary provided by Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is not a man yelling at the wind in this regard either. His opinion that modern virology itself is an extremely weak science is shared by many other medical experts, including such names as Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Stefan Lanka, Dr. Robert Young, Dr. William P. Treving, Dr. Tom Barnett, Torsten Engelbrecht, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to name a few. As explained by Dr. Kaufman, quote, "We have a situation where if we're going to demonstrate that we've discovered a new organism, like they say that a virus would be, then we have to show that we can find that alleged organism in nature, so that we can study it. We can take a specimen of it and look at it in a laboratory, like you, the interviewer, do on a daily basis. And then we can dissect it, and we can see what it's made out of, and take the genetic material and sequence that if there is any." And I just assumed that would be how they discovered viruses. But what has happened is, since the 1950s, they have this procedure that they call isolation, but it's actually a complete inversion of the meaning of that word. What they do is they have a possible or the putative source of an alleged virus or a possible virus in nature that they might have a theory is causing a disease, but they can't actually find it. So what they do is they take the diseased tissue from whatever organism and they mix it in a foreign cell culture, often using cells of monkeys. But they do some further things to make the cell culture not grow well. They're not nice to it. They add poisonous chemicals and they remove critical nutrients, and they create what I call a starvation diet. And then when they show there's damage to those cells in the culture, they say that that's evidence of a virus. And then they show electron microscope pictures of particles, but as we've seen, even the scientists in that field knew about this problem for a long time, that the particles they see are just what happens when cells break down in the process of dying. And they can't be distinguished from each other in any way based on appearance because they've never been actually shown to exist separately in nature, and they've never been purified in any form that could be used for further study, like as a reference material that you mentioned. They do have what they might call reference material available, but what it is they just take fluid from the cell culture and filter it and put it in a vial. And interestingly, and I think this is actually the purpose of why they use this experiment, that's the same exact procedure to manufacture a vaccine. Because that very same fluid from that cell culture is essentially the vaccine material minus the adjuvants. End quote. Dr. Kaufman's claims sound shocking for a variety of reasons. First, can it really be that the process of so-called virus isolation really just involves mixing a diseased person's snot sample with poisons and monkey cells and then claiming the mess that results is somehow an isolated virus? The answer straight from the CDC is that's exactly what they do. First, they use Vero CCL81 cells, which are monkey kidney cells. If one had already isolated a virus, one would think it could be an appropriate experiment to see how healthy monkey cells, I would imagine similar to humans and mammals, react to the introduction of the isolated virus. This, however, is not what the CDC uses the Vero cells for. Instead, they culture them with, quote, heat-activated fetal bovine serum, 5 or 10%, and antibiotics and antimycotics, as well as NP nasopharyngeal and OP oropharyngeal swab specimens from the sick patient who they believe has the new virus. To summarize, exactly as Dr. Kaufman says, the process the CDC and modern virology follows is not to first isolate the virus from the NP and OP specimens and then to see if it can infect a cell, such as a Vero cell. Instead, it is to combine the Vero cell, antibiotics, antimycotics, which are antifungals, fetal bovine serum, which is liquid remaining after blood is drained from a bovine fetus, and a sick person's sputum into a soup. The cultures are then observed under certain conditions as the cells are inevitably damaged by the nutrient-draining antibiotics, which literally means anti-life from the Greek word bios, and antimycotics. In fact, from a 2017 study by Ryu et al. In Scientific Reports, we can see various studies have demonstrated changes in gene expression and regulation in vitro can be introduced by antibiotics. According to another such study drawing exactly this conclusion, quote, data from studies in which antibiotics are used for cell culture should be examined with caution, end quote. Noted. What is also simple to understand about this synopsis is that viruses are considered dead organisms. It would therefore make sense that the excretions which might occur during cell death, brought on by environmental toxins, malnutrition, and or stress factors as introduced to the Vero cell in the culture, could be confused for replication of a virus, dead cell tissue, when in reality it is decay and excretions of the dying cell. What is also somewhat easy to understand but perhaps less easy to stomach is how this process could then be used to make vaccines. Typically, a traditional vaccine, of which the COVID inoculations are not, is understood to contain a killed virus. Considering viruses are isolated in the way described above, however, it's hard to say with any confidence this is actually the case or what is called a killed virus is actually something you'd want inside of you. But traditional vaccines are a topic for another book that I probably will not have any desire to write. To continue, a reinforcing summary by Dr. Tom Cowan. Quote, when you come to do the alignment, from my understanding, the way I explain it to people is when you're talking about finding the genome of a virus, you're talking about finding the pieces or components of a bigger thing, right? So the virus is the bigger thing, and the genome is one of the pieces of this virus, supposedly. And so the question is, how does a human being find out the components of anything? So you can take a book and you can say, what are the letters that make up the book? And as long as you have the book, if you want to, you can go through the painstaking process of writing out the letters that make up that page or that chapter or whatever. But that's how human beings understand what something is made of. They start with the whole thing, and then they take it apart piece by piece, trying to remember which piece lined up with which one, and that's how we do it. Virologists have somehow turned it around and done it the other way. So in other words, they start with a million or so letters, and then they say to you, okay, make the book. Most people would say, which book? And then they say, I'm not telling you which book. This is unbiased de novo genome sequencing, so you can't be biased. End quote. As mentioned, the aforementioned issues around the lack of purification have gone unanswered, with no one from public health organizations willing to have a debate. In the absence of such a debate, the only way to get closer to the truth is to continue asking for proof from those organizations which use this methodology to justify tyranny. To this end, at least 177 Freedom of Information Act requests have been made to governments around the world asking for said proof of SARS-CoV-2, as documented by a Canadian watchdog group. According to the group, all 177 have either confirmed the process Dr. Cowan and Dr. Kaufman claim does not represent isolation, or have outright declined to respond with no proof provided at all. For full disclosure, I will conclude this topic by clarifying that several alternative and public health exiled doctors do find the public health method of isolation satisfactory, including Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Joseph Mercola. They, too, admit that the ability for the alleged virus to create disease is dependent on the person's health conditions, among other factors, and do not support the coercive public health endeavors. But they still believe there is adequate support for the existence and relevance to disease of the virus due to whole genome sequencing, the process Dr. Cowan describes as backwards. They also cite studies which they claim match the proposed genome of the alleged virus. This is fine. In fact, this is more than fine. It's fantastic. It is fantastic to see real scientists with seemingly honest, disinterested intentions disagree and debate on the nature of things. That is science. It is for everyone else to decide for themselves, based on this breadth of opinions, which side they think is more predictive of the situation and should guide their actions toward the best outcome. While I continue to have questions I feel are unanswered from the novel virus proponents and do not believe that paradigm to be a helpful one in my own personal experience, I have no interest in convincing you, dear reader, to decide either way. This is because whether the virus exists or not is irrelevant to the damage done by public health officials in every way we've covered to this point. Lockdowns, masks, censorship, isolation, the tests used, and methodologies used were all still destructive no matter which side is correct. That said, I am not a medical professional, and this book is not about providing any kind of advice about your unique health situation. My only goal here was to present both sides in the interest that you might know a debate exists on this topic at all. Especially as the ideology of the COVID collaborators continues to fall apart and this decade-long culture of censorship continues to plague our society, it is and will continue to be an incredibly relevant debate in the future.